Welcome back. You're listening to Conservative Conversations with Tom Saruf. My guest today is Jon Askonas, who is a returning guest. He is a professor at the Catholic University of America, and he writes a lot on international relations, national security, and the intersection of war, technology, and Republican institutions. And this time we went back to more of his bread and butter on international relations, especially touching on themes of America's posture in the world. So it was a very wide-ranging discussion on important and relevant topics, and of course always tying it back to the rootless principles of American history and philosophy. So we hope you enjoy the episode.
Join the best in the movement. It's Conservative Conversations with ISI, educating for liberty since 1953.
Jon, it's great to have you back on the podcast. I think it was probably like 2 years ago now at this point that we had you on the first time. And I think at ISI, at least, a lot of us know you as like the tech guy, or one of the few conservatives who are very literate in technology, and not only the nuts and bolts of how technology works, but actually more whether it's political theory or whatever concepts you want to describe it, who's literate in that sort of space and how it applies to the questions of political life and of human goods, so to speak. But your background and more of your expertise is in international relations, foreign policy. So we're bringing you on to render your judgments and your expertise on that. And just setting the stage, we're in a very interesting time with respect to things that are happening in the world. We've got a 2-year war going on in Ukraine, and who knows what's going to happen in Israel on any given day with that war. And so your book, or the sort of forthcoming book, or something that you've been working on, I know, is about how militaries forget the lessons that they learn in war. And I'm wondering, we're in this period of time. There's that phrase, there's nothing new under the sun. What is the sort of historical analog, if you can think of one, that we need to be thinking about to confront the problems today that we've forgotten?
That's a really interesting question, Tom. In my work on technology and kind of the social and political effects of technology very much comes out of my background in international relations. I work on military technology, where, in that space, technological change is often seen as, if not completely determinative, highly determinative of the course of history. And yet, outside of the battlefield, we've been reluctant to think the same way socially, culturally, politically about the effects of technology, even though anyone who's even begin to study the question sees that technological changes, when they happen, how they happen, who they advantage and disadvantage, has massive effects. So yeah, that's kind of the connection between my work in international relations and my work in technology. I mean, the period of time that I keep coming back to is sort of the fin de siècle, right? The end of the 19th century, the early 20th century, leading into the First World War. And what I mean by that is, what's going on right now is quite clearly you can think of the war in Ukraine, the war in the Middle East, ongoing confrontations and escalation in and around Taiwan, the South China Sea. These are sort of like the little earthquakes or pre-quakes, really, the tensions that evince massive continental shifts kind of immediately underneath the surface. And just as occurs before a major earthquake, these sort of little tremblers are in some ways evidence of growing tension at that kind of deeper structural level. And I think that period of the very early 20th century is a similar period where there have been massive technological and economic changes that have not yet manifested themselves as geopolitical or in the realm of sort of geopolitics, but their potential is very clearly there, and we're only sort of waiting for a catalytic event that could, bring those. Well, I mean, frankly, you worry about sort of what we would call systemic war, a war over the shape of the international system. We haven't had one since 1945, and we're overdue, to be sort of blunt about it.
Hey there, listener. I wanted to take a quick moment to thank you for listening to Conservative Conversations. This podcast is a production of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute and our mission here at ISI is educating for liberty. If you'd like to join us in fulfilling our mission, consider helping us by rating and reviewing this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you listen, to help us reach more listeners like yourself. Now, back to the show. Yeah, I'm familiar with, I think his name's Grant Allison, this idea of the Thucydides trap, where you have great powers in competition, and there's a lot of these, like, it's kind of crazy to think from our perspective, the Iraq War psychologically, not only psychologically, but also sort of financially in terms of, human life and human costs. That's a very minor war, all things considered, which is kind of crazy to think about.
Yeah.
But like we have now, or this idea of the Thucydides trap is that you have these major players who are sparring and skirmishing in these small theaters and arenas, and they're more or less fighting over this sort of systemic control. I mean, do you think we are in a Thucydides trap? Is there some sort of flaw with that methodology of thinking? Or is maybe he's right in this sort of overdoeness that you're referring to sort of bespeaks that problem?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a number of theoretical frameworks from international relations that all point in the same direction in this case. I mean, the idea that the Thucydides trap is specifically that faced with a rising power, a power that's growing, in terms of political influence, economic and military potential, the power that may be displaced out of sort of fear of the unknown is likely to kind of lash out in ways which ultimately may be self-undermining, but which lead to this kind of systematic conflict. To be blunt, I don't necessarily find the argument that convincing. And there's another very important question, which comes to that. This all comes down to the question of timing, which is how much longer will China be a kind of rising power? Or what kind of rising power will China be? I mean, I think what we're seeing today is, China's sort of global economic influence has not yet caught up to the sheer amount of production and economic size. So we can expect that to continue to grow, but China's own economy may very shortly run into major headwinds, especially from its debt crisis and its population decline. And to the extent that there's anything new under the sun, it is that this is going to occur in the shadow of stagnant global populations and actually declining populations, and more importantly, upside down aging pyramids in every major great power. That is truly unprecedented in human history.
Absolutely. I'd be more curious to hear maybe about the general thesis of this forthcoming book that you have. What drives is it just technology that drives the forgetfulness of our military experience, or what are the drivers of that?
Yeah, so this is from my forthcoming is maybe too generous. I'm in the process of looking at book contracts. It's based on my dissertation. It's an expanded version of my dissertation book, which is very common as an academic. So I look specifically at we should find a little bit mysterious the demonstrable fact that militaries do forget what they learn in war. War is a relatively rare and expensive endeavor. Militaries are highly incentivized to try and learn from war. The U.S. military in particular, which my dissertation looks only at the U.S. military really, although I think the model is generalizable, has its own organizational apparatuses dedicated to lessons learned and kind of preserving historical knowledge. So the mechanism I look at, though, is this disconnect between the way that the kind of U.S. military's own self-understanding of knowledge is something that lives in doctrinal documents, in lessons learned texts, in the schoolhouse, as it were, and the kind of actual character of know-how, which is always sort of organizational and tacit, right? People practicing things, training in things, training others on those things, developing a sense of excellence based on a particular practice. So what I show, I look at a few discrete knowledge areas where we learned how to do it during the course of the Vietnam War, and then we manifestly had forgotten how to do it by the Iraq War, and then learned to do it again in the Iraq War. So counter network targeting, so finding and destroying kind of counterinsurgency networks, not just the people shooting at you, but the financiers and the bomb builders and the smugglers and everything. counter IED targeting, or called counter mine in Vietnam. Basically, how do you stop these networks of people who are blowing up trucks and blowing up soldiers? Kind of battlefield survival and kind of adapting to the tactical environment, and then rapid technology adaptation. How do you identify technologies and weapons that the Army didn't think that we needed or didn't know that we needed it, but turned out to need in this new battlefield, and as rapidly as possible, acquiring, testing, fielding those technologies. And again, so these are 4 tasks. There's discrete tasks, and there's a few kind of subtasks you can imagine that manifestly the Army had very little capability in going into, and it's principally the Army I look at, going into Vietnam and Iraq, but had learned in the course of both of those wars how to do those things. And the question is, well, what happened? Why didn't we remember? And what I argue, what I show, is that this organizational forgetting process is determined by how the military goes about demobilizing after the war. That in many cases, the knowledge was being acquired and built, and skills were being acquired and built through new organizations, whether wartime organizations or massively reorganized conventional organizations, and that when these were destroyed in the demobilization process, that's when that knowledge actually left the military, even if some of the individuals who possessed that knowledge didn't leave the military. And there's some interesting kind of mini cases or examples outside of the U.S. Army that I talk about in my conclusion. So you see a similar phenomenon, I would argue, with close air support in the U.S. Army Air Force in the Second World War, and then going to the Korean War as the Air Force, where in many cases many of the pilots were the same, but this sort of set of practices, cultural liturgies, you might even practices, had totally disappeared and had to be relearned and rebuilt. And when those organizations happen to be retained after wartime, then that knowledge, that skill set also lives on. So one of the strongest examples of this is it's the First Signal Division. I think it's a division coming out of the Vietnam War. Basically, does sort of wartime communications, and not just radio, but this is what had been learned in Vietnam: computer communications, like expeditionary computer communications, and hot data links, that kind of thing. That organization is retained after the war, and that's sort of the foundation of this kind of excellence in the U.S. military for this kind of communications. So that's sort of the thesis. It's very organizational. It's very kind of close to the ground. There isn't a big theory, because I think that's the problem. I think you go astray looking for a big theory when it's actually a very small, subtle factor that does it.
That makes a lot of sense. And I guess the follow up to that would be, if demilitarization that occurs after wartime is one of the big drivers of some of these information and practical losses, I mean, one conclusion that one might draw from hearing and buying into that thesis would be that demilitarization or demobilization is something that shouldn't necessarily actually occur, or there has to be, instead, you have to maintain the liturgies even in peacetime, so that when the next war comes about, one still has those sorts of practices and human capital, organizational capital, ready to mobilize much more easily. At the same time, how would we perhaps balance that with whether or not you agree with the idea that there are potential dangers to these sorts of large military apparatuses just sitting around waiting for something to do, maybe that causes them to go off and do things that we need not really do, or even just the existence of a large military, which is something that, the founders, for instance, many of them were skeptical of having these large peacetime militaries. So how might we sort of hold those two things in tension, or hold them in balance?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question, and I do think that this awareness of the fragility of excellence and the fragility of practice should be, and historically, frankly, has been at the center of how militaries, armies in particular, thought about themselves. And I think, frankly, actually, it's very much a part of the notion that the founders had of the army in particular. But the solution is not necessarily a permanent sort of standing military. In fact, actually, that to my mind, that suggests the fatal flaw in the idea of a permanent standing military, which is that you're going to need to mobilize for war. The U.S. military, the U.S. Army, is not prepared. This is the biggest kind of open secret within defense policy in the U.S. The U.S. Army is not prepared to fight and win, even a single theater war, against an actual great power adversary without significant mobilization. The U.S. Army is not capable of fighting and winning a war against an adversary bigger than the state of Iraq, at least in terms of including the aftermath, anyways. And we know this because doing Iraq almost broke the U.S. Army. There's this amazing moment in 2006, leading up to the surge, where General Petraeus had just been named as the commander of MNFI, the combat command in Iraq, and he's testifying before Congress, and they're saying, General Petraeus, you said you need, I think it's 36 battalions, and we know, where did you get this number from? And because if you read your counterinsurgency, manual that you've written famously, and you do the math based on how many counterinsurgents you need per estimated size of insurgency and population size, you should need many more people. And his reply was something to the effect of, well, you have to include the Iraqi National Police and Army in your estimate of kind of counterinsurgents. But the actual truth of the matter was, there was no one else. That, according to the Army's own mobilization, called the horse blanket, and basically the mobilization charts, that was the total capacity of the U.S. Army to mobilize all of the reserves, before you were dipping into the individual ready reserves and then into kind of, beyond that, the draft or whatever. Now, so for your listeners, to know, you have the active force, which is the Army, active duty soldiers. You have the reserves, which are people, units that are prepared to mobilize for war or other contingency. You have National Guard units. Then you have this individual ready reserve, which are usually people who have retired from or left the active army, who have a period where they are in this database, basically prepared to be mobilized in case of war. One effect of the move to an all-volunteer force in 1974, I believe it was, is that this IRR has not worked the way that we thought it would work. The more people stay in the military for longer, the fewer people are in the IRR. And there was a really bombshell within certain circles report from a Army officer who studied this issue at Army War College a year ago, maybe less than a year ago, that showed that for certain critical capabilities, there are less than a few dozen people or a few hundred people in the IRR. Like, there are less than a few hundred tankers, people who can drive tanks, in the IRR. So even though we might have extra tanks ready to mobilize, we don't have the people to mobilize for them. Which is why, when I was working on this dissertation, one of the things that became clear to me was that there would be a draft if there ever any significant war the U.S. faced. And at the time, that was heresy. You were, under no circumstances would the U.S. ever fight a war where there would be a draft. Well, if you've been watching it very carefully, you'll see in, Foreign Affairs, in the Wall Street Journal, other places, very subtly over the last few years, there have been more and more op-eds saying, actually, we might need a draft. We need to actually get the selective service working. We need to draft women in selective service. That isn't just driven by political correctness. There's actually a military component to it as well. So this is a long answer to your question. We need to be prepared for mobilization. What that means is that we need to have a military that is actually structured for serious mobilization, which we don't really have right now. So we need to think about, for example, we used to have what's called a cadre army. So rather than having a large number of units that are basically prepared to, mobilize on a 30, 90, 180-day timeline to go to war, we need units that are prepared kind of a 180, 360-day timeline with a small number of officers and non-commissioned officers, overloaded on non-commissioned officers that would be prepared to take in, green recruits, draftees, basically, in case of an actual contingency. That's how we fought. That's how we built the army that won the World War I, that won World War II. That's our kind of traditional way of having a standing army. I could go on about this forever, but that's my kind of initial take. We can talk about the technology side too, if you want.
Yeah, I'd like to get into the technology side at some point. And everything you said rings pretty familiar to me because my dad's in the army and he's high level officer in the special forces. I won't say any more, lest I accidentally leak national security secrets. Which he doesn't tell me. He doesn't really tell me all that much, but I understand.
Yeah,
Basically everything. I was tracking everything you were saying.
yeah,
I want
yeah.
to ask a different question, which maybe cuts against the thrust of what I was suggesting in my previous question, which is what
Sure.
about the idea of of a draft as like not a national program? I hate the idea of national programs. Maybe that's my just conservative recalcitrance
Hmm.
coming through, my hesitation on any large scale national program. But like when you think about the needs today, not only for you know the stakes and the cost of military, um, the how high the stakes would be in a military conflict, but also the I'm going to stake a claim here and say the sort of the need for a recovery of maybe more traditional manliness. This sort of I think that the military is seen as an institution that helps produce excellent people, and what I mean by that is people who are strong, courageous. They have practical know-how. They know whatever their specific thing that they're doing is. They can do that well. They can shoot a gun. That's an important part of not only just being a man but also being a free citizen and a free person, is the sort of the independence that being in the military creates, which you're part of this highly hierarchical, orderly, disciplined group, but that actually gives you, of course, and conservatives understand this intuitively, this gives you the actual capacity to exercise your freedom properly. In my thought, and also when you think about sort of the obligations that we have to one another, one thought that comes to mind, and I know my dad is, I think, a proponent of this, is the idea of national military service. Like everyone goes in for a 2-year term or a 4-year term, and you'd have to think about how to organize it so you're not swamping the military with millions and millions of young people all at once for no real reason or no real use other than the the virtues that it engenders. But what what might we do with that? How might this contribute to either some of the problems or potential upsides to the sort of things that we're talking about here?
Yeah, I mean, if you were to sum up the kind of bigger lesson in my dissertation book, it is if you aren't practicing something, you can't do it.
Yeah.
There's a great Anduril, the defense company, just took out a full page ad in the Wall Street Journal on with the message of we can't win with blueprints, and I just absolutely love it. You actually have to have it. You can't you having this is the big change from this is the big kind of metaphysical question, the big difference between the kind of reindustrialization folks and the world of globalization and sort of the service economy, of the kind of McKinsey approach to the world. At the end of the day, it matters whether you have it or not, in a tangible form. So one interesting upside of something like a national service program, even if it's not national military services, it forces you to actually build the infrastructure to do what you need to do in case of a draft, right? And you could even have the same people, principally U.S. Army, National Guard, organizations that would be running a draft, running the logistics of this new national service program, right? So then the selective service. The selective service is a total joke today, right? There's no energy and no resources in it. Totally, uh, you know, 40 years behind in modernization. Could not run a draft today if it was asked to. Again, this is a dirty open secret of like American defense. We couldn't do it if we needed to. So one way to gain that capability back is, and something I've been thinking about and will probably be a follow-on project from the book, is the identification of isomorphic tasks. So one of the really interesting things that you see in some organizations, including folks in the special operations community, is if you can't train on something for any number of reasons, political, practical, funding, or whatever, one way to kind of preserve a competency is to find a task that shares important features with the task that you're trying to preserve, right? So one interesting example of this is I love in Tom Wolfe's amazing nonfiction book on the the astronaut program, the name of which is somehow escaping me. Do you know this book?
No, I don't think so.
It's a very famous book. The Right Stuff, of course. The Right Stuff. Really worth reading, and actually worth reading or worth listening. The Audible version is read by Dennis Quayle, I think, and it's fantastic. Not Dennis Quayle, the actor Dennis Quaid. Sorry, need another cup of coffee. Anyways, both the U.S. and the Soviet Union face the question of what is an astronaut? What are the actual skills that you need an astronaut to have, and where do you find those skills? And it wasn't obvious. Both of them ended up basically picking test pilots as the closest kind of equivalent skill, and I think that was probably the right choice. But they also considered submariners, circus acrobats in the Soviet Union, anyways, and a number of other professions to try to identify this question of like what is the where are these sort of isomorphic skills. So similarly with you were talking about mobilization earlier. Like again, right now our defense industrial mobilization practices are totally rusty. We have no real experience with them practically. One way to actually be prepared for a conflict is to exercise those, and exercise them, quote unquote, unnecessarily, perhaps. Identify some specific problem that is a serious problem worthy of some degree of mobilization, and actually practicing the organizational, policy, legal authorities required to do a wartime mobilization, just to sort of shake off the rust a little bit. So I think this sort of modality of thinking about important contingencies and being prepared for them, not only by doing drills and other kinds of explicit preparations, but also by finding isomorphic tasks that can require us to be prepared. I think it's a useful thing that I'm working on. I'm fleshing out.
I think I understand that. Let me just test if I do. So, like, if I were a fire chief and I want more firefighters, I would look for the sorts of, I guess, complementary tasks or sort of skills that are involved in that, and then find other professions or other things that would be useful, and then I can pull them over. So they already have some sort of background competency in the things that would be needed for them to be a firefighter, and then I could teach them the rest.
Yeah. I mean, and that, practically speaking, in particularly elite organizations that are looking for something very specific, that is what you actually find.
Gotcha. I've got another sort of related question, and this might push us in the tech direction more.
Sure.
Past weekend, I went to the USS New Jersey battleship, IO-class battleship. Huge ship. My dad came and visited, and so I was like, what's something we could do? It's like, that we would both love this. And we did. We kept looking at each other in awe. Like, it was amazing. It's a floating city. It has everything you could think of that a city would need, and it's on water. Carpentry, welding, obviously all the food, including protein and full meals for 4 meals a day for 1,500 to 3,000 people on the ship. They're going for months at a time. Barbershop, like, it has everything. And I was amazed because I was kind of thinking, like, I'm kind of a smart guy, but I don't even think I could manage the functions of a rowboat, let alone a massive ship. And just thinking about every logistical element, all of the interplay between all of those things, scheduling, personnel, everything. And one thing we were talking about with one of the tour guides, or asked him about, was it's all mechanical. There's digital and electrical stuff, but it's not digital the way that things are now digital, in the sense that these ships are like 30 or 40 years out of service. And that means the people are like 30 to 40 years out of service, who would know how to work all of the knobs and wheels that you needed to turn to get the thing to fire and hit the target that you want it to. But you could hit a phone booth 30 miles away in like a minute with these enormous shells. It was truly amazing and so impressive. But it kind of dawned on me, and my dad and I were talking about this. If we don't have the people who could do this, if we had to, let's say we had to remobilize the USS New Jersey, we wouldn't have the people to actually run it. And so I'm wondering, I think this is probably one aspect of speaking to your thesis, and it's maybe in a different direction. But I think the tech angle comes in when you think about what Chris Buskirk did an episode with us, and we differentiated between the world of nuts and bolts and the world of bits. And it sort of speaks to the idea of you can't do this thing with a blueprint. Is we have all of this digital stuff, which is impressive. Somehow it's more technologically sophisticated than even all of the weapon systems and the logistical elements that goes into this amazing battleship. But it's more fragile in the sense that it can be taken out with like an EMP or some sort of digital attack. It could be hacked, like what we saw with that ship that took out the Francis Scott Key Bridge. Versus the more mechanical thing is like you have to make this thing sink. You can't hijack it or take it offline unless you just obliterate it. So I'm wondering, I guess I don't know exactly what the question. I guess the question is this: what would be required, or what are the sorts of things that we need to do to remind ourselves of how to use these sorts of things, or sort of educate ourselves on the sorts of more, I guess, bare bones practices that won us something like World War II. And I think I'd also be curious to hear about what digitization and technological advance does with this sort of thesis that we're playing with here.
Yeah, well, that's such a huge question. I will say one thing I think you're going to see is you're already seeing this a little bit with Anduril and SpaceX. New American companies. One of America's great strengths has always been its dynamism.
Mm-hmm.
It's the ability to, thanks to freedom of association, for new groups of people to come together and undertake projects and build amazing things. And I think what we're going to see is not so much the kind of revival of the great American companies that used to do these things, but new companies starting from scratch. And one of the ways that they're going to succeed is with kind of leapfrog technologies, right? They're not going to, in many cases, they're not going to sort of rediscover how we used to do things. They're just going to figure out what's the best way to do it now with today's technologies. So, take Anduril. I mean, Anduril in some ways is leading the charge on reindustrialization. It's also the most sophisticated software developer in the defense space, up there with Palantir anyways, right? They have a software first approach to systems integration, which is much more efficient than having to do it the old way with hardware. So, I think that this atoms versus bits is useful in terms of thinking about where we invest and not being over reliant on digital technology, or not being over reliant at the point of execution. I mean, none of these technologies you wouldn't build them without digital technology in design, in implementation, there's all kinds of digital technology that, even if it's a quote unquote dumb product, we've learned to build things using CNC tools, which are digital tools. There's all kinds of ways in which digital technology is useful and necessary, vital for building in the world of atoms. I don't know if you saw SpaceX's new Raptor 3 engine, but one of the things that they managed to do is they've been pushing the envelope on 3D printing, and they basically managed to produce or to replace a lot of like mechanical tubing and valving with, a extremely precisely 3D printed manifold, like within the body of the rocket, the engine itself. So that's the first thing I would say. Again, I do come back to this notion of isomorphic tasks, and this is where one thing I'm hopeful about, right, is we do have a kind of America for a long time had a very kind of tinkering centric culture. This is actually hugely beneficial. I mean, one of the things that the Soviets worried about was the fact that every American soldier had more mechanical, or not every American soldier, your average American soldier had much more mechanical ability than your average Soviet soldier, because they probably owned a car, they were familiar with cars, many of them were sort of diesel heads. And so when it came to thinking about like battlefield, like maintenance, repair, and logistics, this is an advantage. So I think anything we can do to kind of rebuild some of that culture of working with your hands, tinkering with tinkering with your hands is useful. I think that if you look at what's going on in Ukraine, I mean, maybe swarm autonomy will replace this soon, but what we're seeing is a lot of first-person piloted drones, and it seems clear that at least for the next 5 years or so, that'll be the kind of dominant paradigm of drone warfare. And again, I think that maybe gives us a little bit of an advantage. But we should actually be thinking about this. And my concern is that we maybe actually don't have people at the top who are thinking about these questions.
Yeah, I'd be curious. I mean, ISI wants to form and educate the next cohorts of American leaders. So not just the next president, but the next 15 presidents, and the next 15 national security advisors. So what does a future president or national security advisor, or a whole slew of them, need to be thinking about in this arena? It's very broad and open-ended, so take it however you'd like.
It's a good question. I mean, I would say two things. First, I mean, I think there's nothing like history, and especially biography, and kind of very close-in histories, to give you a sense and an appreciation for the difficulty of doing these kinds of things, and for how you actually have to build organizations and solve these kinds of problems. You can't, and these are not problems you can wave away with a hand. You can't solve them by talking about them or chit-chatting. You actually have to, you come to appreciate the daring do, as it were, required in running a great organization. So I think that's an important thing to kind of recover. The other thing I would say is it's not so much, I don't know if it's most usefully taught in a classroom, right? There's a need for practical experience. That French phrase savoir faire, like literally, meaning knowledge in making, but really having that notion of like know-how or ability to do, skill in doing. And I think anything we can do and I think the way you get skill in doing is, as anything, is with practice.
Yeah.
I think one of the things ISI does that's really useful is not so much not only the seminars and the conversations, but also you sponsor all these organizations, student organizations, and that skill in actually the kind of political and organizational skill to run one of those organizations is incredibly useful practice. So, if I were ISI and I were thinking about these kinds of national security problems, I'd be thinking about, again, what are the isomorphic tasks? What are the things you can practice in a useful and small way as a student that actually begin to set you on this path towards excellence in this much kind of broader arena of statesmanship and production at the highest level?
Excellent. Well, I want to close with a question or a couple questions. I think that are a bit more focused on America's posture in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Sort of what we were talking about before we came online is your review or critique of H.R. McMaster's use or understanding of strategic empathy. So maybe you could describe for our listeners what strategic empathy is, and what you see McMaster, former Secretary of Defense, doing that you think is misguided in terms of how he's viewing America's approach to the world. And our interference is perhaps a loaded word. Our involvement in foreign affairs.
Yeah. So the context here is this book he wrote. I think Battlegrounds is what it's called. And I wrote a review, not of Battlegrounds really, but of a shorter, almost excerpt of it on China that he had published, I think, in Foreign Affairs. So I think the concept of strategic empathy is useful, right? The value of the ability to get inside, as it were, the head of one's opponents. It comes from this book by Zachary Shore called The Sense of the Enemy, where he demonstrates, a number of leaders, I think mostly non-American leaders, demonstrating the importance of this kind of strategic empathy and the practices they use to get it. The problem is that I thought McMaster's application of it was very shallow, and in the end, very American-centric. I mean, what is essential to Shore, right, is that even if you're a senior communist official, even getting what you want, world communist revolution, entails, if you want to actually be successful at it, entails learning and understanding your opponents, understanding the way that they think, the way that they see the world. And that, of course, always comes with a sense of nobody thinks of themselves as a as an authoritarian or a despot or whatever in their own eyes, right? There's always a sort of just a narrative of justification, and so if you aren't able to articulate and understand it, and one might even say empathize with that narrative of justification, then you haven't really understood your enemy at all. And I thought, at least in the excerpt that I reviewed, McMaster was completely guilty of this. And I think the interesting tell was, he was looking at these China. He visited China, I think, one time. Maybe I can't find any record of it. Another visit to China, and he went to this museum and he was looking at all the these sort of Ming Dynasty artifacts or whatever, and then he was sort of postulating about what this meant for China's 21st century foreign policy, and of course, completely ignoring the actual forces shaping, say, a Xi Jinping, which are not so much Ming century pottery, but Marxist-Leninism as taught in the various party schools, the atmosphere of being a party official and the son of a senior party official, the story of of the Long March, of the Cultural Revolution. These are the things that are sort of deeply embedded in the minds of contemporary Chinese leaders, and that's what empathy would actually look like. And I think what you see, for all the talk of empathy and historical understanding from a certain kind of neoconservative author, underlying all of that is a complete failure to go outside of the American ideals of a certain notion of freedom, of justice, of democracy, of equality, whatever. And if you can't get outside those, even conceptually, then you have no ability to understand the enemy.
Gotcha. That's I read the book. I struggle to remember everything. It's like a 500-page book, so there's a lot in there, and a lot of it's sort of like specific facts. I think he maybe does a better job of that than he did in whatever piece he wrote in Foreign Affairs, which is, by necessity much shorter. But I think one of the things I guess I came away from the book, or the notion of strategic empathy, is that, yeah, like you have to understand who you're dealing with, not only in terms of partners on the ground, but also like who your adversaries are, what makes them tick, and how you can use that against them to beat them at their own game. What I also sort of found interesting in your criticism was that not only is he not stepping outside of like American freedom and democracy, but also the sort of posture that America has to be very involved in all aspects of, I guess, vying for control of the international system. And my question to you would be, is he fundamentally correct that, we do have to sort of continue to be the hegemon, albeit, because I think strategic empathy is actually maybe a move away from a more hubristic understanding that, like, we can kind of just do whatever we want and just flex our muscle, and whether militarily, economically, or otherwise, and get our way, which we've covered with other people on this podcast. But maybe it was a move towards a more restrained version of that. Well, we're still going to be involved, but we're going to, because we have better understanding of what our adversaries do, that gives us the ability to maybe take our foot off in some cases, or understand where our central challenges really are, as opposed to just sort of trying to do everything everywhere all at once without any real understanding of what's going on, because we have this sort of sense that we're so great and we can do whatever. But yeah, that's a long way of getting to the question of, do we actually still need to be this hegemon, or maybe the flaw is in not taking a step back and saying, well, actually, I think retrenchment is not only, if not more necessary, a perfectly viable alternative to thinking about America's role vis-a-vis the rest of the world.
I think the question. Obviously, I think we need a more restrained foreign policy. I think we're completely overextended in classic imperial hubris. But to draw back to McMaster, though, I think that the most difficult party or enemy to have strategic empathy towards is your domestic opponents. And I think if my understanding is that's certainly the case in this book as well, right? The question is, the question towards which, what should our foreign policy be is, as the Sharon statement puts it, what are the just interests of the United States? What is good for the United States? More importantly, what is good for her people? And I don't think it's a coincidence that many of the people that H.R. McMaster commanded in battle in Iraq and other places, completely oppose the policies that he's called for and the political positions that he's implicitly taken. And I can't speak for him in particular, although I gather that his book has a new post January 6th edition. But certainly the other people he would otherwise ally himself with have shown very little empathy for the plight of the white working class in America, who have borne the vast majority of the costs, blood and treasure of our kind of imperialistic foreign wars. And I have a very difficult time taking seriously any kind of grand theory of American foreign policy that doesn't begin by asking the question of whom it ought to serve.
Yeah, I mean,
before I'm going to say, here's how I would put it. Before America can be a force for good in the world, America needs to be a force for good in America.
Fair enough. Yeah, I mean, that was pretty clear to me, the sort of divide during the Republican debates between, I guess, people who think we can deal with the domestic and the foreign problems at once versus people who want to focus more on the issues at home before we go out. I mean, I think the real point was like Mike Pence and Vivek. Like Vivek said, it's not morning in America anymore. And Pence's response, I think, was, you have a very small view of what America's power is. I also saw this in the debate between Trump and Biden, too, is like, Biden seems to suggest like there is no limit to American power or like American possibility. Like we can literally do anything. And that to me, I was like, where's the sense of restraint at all? Is that sort of what you're getting at?
Oh, well, I mean, we could go on for another hour just on this thing alone. I mean, yes, but to draw it back to the beginning, I think it does come from folks at the top, folks involved in these foreign policy decisions, actually having very little sense of the operational realities it takes to generate military power. I wouldn't accuse McMaster of this, but most of the other, it was sort of funny during the Ukraine conflict, watching the neocons discover the defense industrial base. Discover that there are actual material limits on American power, and they're actually, in dire shape. And suddenly this was actually a politically important issue when they had been manifestly ignoring it for 25 years. And condemning anyone who actually thought we needed to focus on it as an isolationist of some kind.
Yeah, I mean, maybe this is where we can close, is this sort of conflict of visions between maybe a more practical and realistic understanding of the material, logistical, organizational know-how, ability, and also the will, not just political will, but the willingness of the people to be involved, to have a more forthright, aggressive, dare I say, posture versus something that's more, or sorry, I guess the more realistic and practical, not only the know-how and organizational stuff, all the stuff that we've been talking about, that then calls for more restraint or reservation before we're involved versus the more extensive and, dare I say, aggressive posture. What's the reconciliation, or where does the rubber meet the road on which of these visions not only will win out in the context of actual foreign affairs, but the direction that we as conservatives in particular should be orienting ourselves? Because I think this is not only a very live issue within conservative politics, or not only within national politics, but particularly how conservatism has shaped this sort of discussion and where it has been.
I mean, another massive question. It was sort of almost a trope on the left, maybe 20 years ago, to complain about the militarization of American foreign policy. And not just on the left, it's actually very international criticisms. If you go back and read Russian criticisms about the United States in that time period, you also see this hyper-militarization of U.S. foreign policy. And I think it's become, certainly for my students who are, were born after 9/11, we've forgotten how radical a shift this was, and how un-American, frankly, a shift this was. I mean, the level of military activity we're engaging in around the world is completely without precedent in American history outside of active major war like the Second World War. Completely unprecedented. And the shape of our constitution, the shape of our political institutions is not made for this kind of mills. It will not coexist for long. And any of our founding fathers, who were all classically educated, would have seen that this is sort of a path to empire. And the empire arrives when you have to decide between maintaining a certain kind of international or posture beyond one's borders and the clashes with the existing republican institutions. So I think we are at a moment for choosing, and I think we need to choose to continue to be a republic. And I think that will have major implications for the shape of world order. But I think that to not make that choice would be even worse.
Gotcha. I mean, I have got one more question based on that, which
Sure.
is, and it's hard to make predictions, but like, what might this look like practically? What would have to change, or what would, after we make these sorts of philosophical mindset changes and then implement or put put our money where our mouth is, so to speak, what would actually look different globally, and what might we have to accept that is a trade-off that kind of comes with that, even if we don't like the trade-off?
Yeah, no, well, I mean, I think it would come with, majorly downsizing some of our defense commitments and accepting that will give us less leverage in the foreign policy of those countries. Accepting that the Middle East will comport itself in ways that we might not like. Accepting that Europe might end up with a more pro-China foreign policy than we otherwise would like if we were sort of otherwise fully engaged there. I think it would involve shifting a lot of focus from military power to economic power. In a scenario where maybe we're not doing enough. And the major thing is I think it will involve a major overhaul of our kind of domestic institutions of foreign policy making. I mean, they were made for an era, the Cold War, where we were truly kind of, where on the one hand we were invested in globally contesting communism pretty much anywhere in the world. On the other hand, we also had a very distinctive set of what our interests were. And what you see going later into the Cold War is that we begin to lose a sense of our grand strategy, so to speak, and then things really begin to kind of go awry. And now we're living very much in the aftermath of that, where we have these institutions which are globally invested, but the issues about which they're globally invested are like, gay rights in Uganda, or even these less kind of controversial example, like, it isn't clear to me the quality of elections in Lesotho is something that like American taxpayer dollars ought to go to. And it's based on this sort of 30 years stale theory of like democratic peace or whatever. So yeah, the world will I think we need to return to the world as sort of George Kennan saw it, right? There are a few places where, George Kennan, I think, had a highly anti-imperialistic sense of U.S. foreign policy. That as long as the U.S. prevented some other empire from arising, and was able to ensure the kind of friendliness of at least several of the other major centers of world production and the free openness of kind of the global commons, now to include space and the internet, that America would be all right. And I think that's what we need to preserve. Because right now we're in the paradoxical space of we're so hyper-invested in military power, they're actually losing ground in important kind of economic and structural issues. The sort of global authoritarian push to rein in the internet, not just from countries like China, but also from the EU increasingly, that is a huge potential long-term structural issue for American power and sovereignty that isn't getting the attention it deserves because we have a over-militarized sense of foreign policy.
Well, that is a good place to end. Thanks again, Jon. Second time in 2 great episodes.
Thank you, Tom. I'm really, really grateful to be on again.
Absolutely.
I'm a big fan of what you're doing at ISI.
Thank you very much. And as you know, we offer an opportunity to plug whatever you would like to promote.
Yeah.
So have at it.
Yeah, so I've got I'll have a new essay in Comment magazine this fall called Building the Future in the Face of the Apocalypse, which your listeners might be interested in. And then one of my other big things on my plate is we're launching a Master's of Public Policy program at Catholic University, which I think will be really appealing for your audience. So check out the MPP at CUA.
Awesome. Thanks, John. We'll have to have you back on a third time, and sometime
Third time's a
soon.
charm.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Well, thanks very much. Thank you for listening to Conservative Conversations with ISI. If you've enjoyed this episode, be sure to check out our website at isi.org/resources to see all that we offer our members, including the Intercollegiate Review, select modern age articles, debates, lectures, and of course, this podcast. Thanks again for listening. Don't forget to rate and review, and we will see you next time on Conservative Conversations with ISI.